Hi, and welcome to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. This is episode 2, a model capitulation, the massacre at Fort William Henry, 1757. According to historian Michael Laramie, in order to construct a fort like William Henry, a giant wooden box is built and sunken into the ground. The box is then filled in with dirt from trenches below. A parapet provided cover, and a rampart provided a firing platform. The fort itself was placed on a 20-foot-high sandy embankment, protected by the lake in the north and a swamp in the south. Bastions were extended from each point, and a 30-foot-wide trench surrounded the site. By 1757, English prospects on the New York frontier were greatly diminished due to the defeat at Oswego the year before. British forces had retreated to Fort Edward above Albany while maintaining their presence at the southern end of Lake George, anchored by Fort William Henry. Public pressure was mounting in the colonies on Britain to strike a fatal blow to France's war effort along the northern frontier. While Quebec was briefly considered, Louisbourg was settled upon as the preferred target. The seizure of the fortress would provide access to the St. Lawrence River and further on to the capital at Quebec. The British had stripped the northern frontiers of troops, and the French saw their chance to strike a fatal blow along the New York waterways. An earlier winter raid in 1757, consisting of over 1,600 French, led by Governor-General Vaudreuil's younger brother Rigaud, were repulsed when a sudden blizzard dropped over 3 feet of snow and forced them to lift the 4-day siege. Without artillery or siege ladders, the raiders opted to destroy the whaleboats and sawmills needed to help any British invasion move north against Fort Carillon. The previous year's victory at Oswego had also increased tensions between Vaudreuil and Montcalm over the use of les guerres sauvages. High ransom prices paid the previous summer had caused more than 2,000 native warriors to show up in Montreal by the spring of 1757. This was the largest pan-Indian force ever assembled by the French. Jesuits were assigned as liaison officers to over 36 Indian nations. Allies from as far as Iowa arrived, but no interpreter could be found. Native allies scored the first victory of the campaign near Sabbath Point on Lake George on July 23, 1757. French raiding parties tracking English Mohawk scouts south came upon a flotilla of English boats resting in a cove. They captured or killed over 250 out of the 350-strong English raiding party sent north to destroy the French woodmills outside of Carillon. General Webb, the British officer in charge of the war efforts on the northern frontier, just happened to be on a tour of Fort William Henry's defenses when a few of the surviving British whaleboats pulled up to the docks. As panic spread among the fort's garrison, Webb quickly gathered his staff and galloped off towards Fort Edward, promising reinforcements. On July 30th, 8,000 French forces, including Troupes de la Marine, Troupes de Terre, Canadian militia, and 2,000 native warriors, set off down Lake George against Fort William Henry. The French flotilla contained 250 bateaux and 150 war canoe. Some of the bateaux were roped together in a catamaran style to support the large artillery train. Colonel George Monro was in charge of the defense of Fort William Henry and had with him the 35th Regiment of Foot. They were supplemented by various colonial militia from New York and New England, giving Monro a total of 2,400 troops and 18 cannon mounted on the walls of his fort. He tried to restart the sawmills and establish another lake fleet, but the earlier French raids had devastated British resources. Without a fleet to contest French movements on the lake, Monro could only hunker down in his stoutly constructed fortification. He quickly assigned runners to General Webb at Fort Edward in hopes of garnering the promised reinforcements. General Webb possessed around 3,000 men between Edward and the surrounding outpost. He could march directly to Monro's aid, but risked an ambush along the dark portage road that led to Fort William Henry. To get a better picture of the geography, let's go back to a famous scene from The Last of the Mohicans, where Colonel Monro's daughters are ambushed with their British escort on the narrow and wooded portage road north. General Webb judged the threat of an ambush to be too great, and the defeat of his forces would leave the road wide open to Albany. Webb never considered the fort at the foot of Lake George to be a bastion of the defense, but merely an outpost to monitor French movements and facilitate British movements along the water corridor to Canada. General Webb's plan was to consolidate his own forces and make a stand where he could be supplied directly from the Hudson. A partie de la guerre of over 3,000 native and French Canadians landed near the southern terminus of Lake George and cut off the fort on August 3rd. As Webb had feared, this force proceeded directly to the Portage Road to lay an ambush for any reinforcements sent. Colonel Monro had refused calls for the fort's surrender on August 6th, and the French proceeded to dig diagonal siege lines toward the fort. The Marquis de Montcalm's forces were positioned northwest of the fort and encamped on sloping ground near to where the modern Lake George High School now stands. British soldiers, militia, and native allies fought from bastions and lived in barracks designed to house only 500 people. The rest of the garrison would normally have been encamped east of the works in a fortified camp. As the French siege lines crept ever closer, the wounded would have taken shelter in subterranean casements. This level would have included a hospital, supply closet, pantry, and jail. Despite valiant sallies, after 3 days the French were able to advance their siege lines just west of the fort's battered bastion, near where the modern-day Fort William Henry Hotel and Resort now stands. Several era graves were uncovered during the construction of the resort, and current archaeological work on the site continues to this day. The French were able to bring up a 9-gun heavy breech battery set up to face the crumbling western wall on August 9th. Montcalm felt his opponent had honorably and ably defended his post, so he planned to offer the British the full honors of war if they would surrender. French scouts had recently intercepted a letter from General Webb which denied reinforcements to Monro, and the Marquis included this captured correspondence in his offer to the British. Faced with a brutal bombardment and possible slaughter if the post was stormed by force, Monro inquired as to the terms being offered. Montcalm's offer included the ability to leave the fort unmolested as parolees of war for 18 months with personal items, flags, sidearms, and a single cannon. Colonel Monro quickly agreed to these terms and furnished Montcalm's staff with a wonderful celebratory dinner that included the last of the wine from the officers' mess. It was a model capitulation that perfectly encapsulated European standards of gentlemanly warfare. The Marquis gathered his native allies that evening and informed them of the surrender. Insulted by the complete lack of consultation given, and impoverished by missing the fur trapping season, native warriors seethed at this blatant disregard for their honor. The hard-fought siege quickly gave way to widespread looting even before British forces were scheduled to depart for Fort Edward. French officers had lost control of the Coureur de Bois and native scouts who raided the fort's liquor stores and began to scalp and rob the wounded. The looting spread to the fortified encampment east of the fort and greatly frightened the mass of both civilians and soldiers preparing their departure. Though guaranteed safe passage and a guard of 300 French, including native chiefs, the British force decided to hastily depart at dawn the next day. The rising sun would only serve to illuminate the horror that unfolded on August 10, 1757. Before dawn broke, gravely wounded British soldiers were publicly dragged out of their sick huts and butchered, as their French guards had been removed by the French surgeon put in charge of their care. Panicked camp followers quickly ditched their personal belongings as baggage choked the portage trail towards Fort Edward. As the bedraggled and frightened English column made it to the tree line, Abenaki warriors set upon the rear of the column first, and all order broke down. The front of the column rushed towards their Canadian escort marching in advance, but the Canadian officers did little to restrain allies and kin that many had blood, marriage, or commercial ties to. Monro took his officers and mostly women camp followers immediately back to the fort to seek Montcalm's protections. Provincial soldiers scattered and made for the woods, driven forward by the sound of Fort Edward's signal guns and the pursuit of French native warriors. Over 185 British were murdered and almost another 700 taken captive by native warriors. Montcalm was able to buy hundreds back, but still several hundred captives appeared several days later, being dragged through the streets of Montreal. Governor-General Vaudreuil demanded their immediate release, but was rebuked when native warriors boiled a single captive alive right there on the cobblestone streets. Vaudreuil agreed to a hefty sum equal to a full year's pay for a French soldier in order to free each captive. The massacre at Fort William Henry would develop from a dispute over plunder into a serious international diplomatic crisis. No surrendering French force would be given the full honors of war for the rest of the conflict. Colonel Monro wouldn't make it back to Fort Edward until August 16th and only under a full French escort. He would die 3 months later. Historian Richard Waddington comments, Unhappily for the renown of Montcalm and his army, this fine feat of arms was terminated by this terrible massacre. The British abrogated the terms of surrender almost immediately and blamed the French actions as intentional hostage-taking. Native warriors contracted smallpox from their interactions with sick prisoners and stolen personal items, as this devastated the manpower available to the tribes of the upper Great Lakes. Montcalm ordered Fort William Henry to be burned and returned to Fort Carillon, satisfied that he had properly chastised the British. Reconstructed the exact original design and size in the 1950s by local businessmen, the fort serves as an anchor of the tourism industry in modern-day Lake George Village.